Officer Kyle Mercer laughed. Special Agent Dana Caldwell didn't. In the dim glow of the streetlights, Mercer's smirk stretched wide as he gripped his gun, its weight a familiar extension of his power. Across from him, Caldwell stood motionless, her FBI badge gleaming under the flashing red and blue lights. He saw it, mocked it, then drew on her anyway. 2 minutes later, the cuffs locked around his wrists. It was just past dusk when Officer Kyle Mercer pulled onto a quiet street in downtown Atlanta. The city hummed with its usual energy, but this particular stretch of road was calm. As he rolled past an intersection, his eyes caught movement. A black SUV with dark tinted windows slowing but failing to come to a full stop at a stop sign. A minor traffic violation, but enough to warrant his attention. He flicked on his lights and accelerated forward. The vehicle responded immediately, pulling over to the curb without hesitation. Mercer took his time stepping out of his cruiser. He enjoyed these moments, the slow walk toward an unknown driver, the feeling of control. It was routine, but it always carried the possibility of escalation. As he approached the driver's side window, the SUV's tinted glass rolled down, revealing a black woman in her mid-30s. She was calm, composed, her hands resting at the top of the steering wheel in plain sight. A flicker of irritation crossed Mercer's face. He had pulled over plenty of people who stammered, fumbled, or scrambled to explain themselves. He was used to the nervous energy that came with flashing lights in a rearview mirror, but this woman wasn't giving him that satisfaction. "License and registration," he demanded. His voice was sharp, clipped. Without a word, she reached toward the passenger seat to retrieve her purse. That's when Mercer noticed something glinting on her hip, a badge clipped to her belt. His pulse quickened. A second later, she held it up for him to see, her movements steady and deliberate. The gold lettering reflected the streetlights, unmistakable even in the dim glow. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, Mercer said nothing. His eyes flicked between her face and the badge, scanning for any sign of uncertainty. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone claiming to be law enforcement. His first instinct was doubt. He smirked, his fingers twitching near his holster. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. She remained silent, waiting for his next move. That only fueled his irritation. Something about her composure, the way she didn't flinch, didn't beg for understanding, it unsettled him. The badge might have been real, but he didn't care. To him, she was just another driver who needed to be put in her place. He let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head as he reached for his gun. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in his palm, a reminder of his authority. He raised it just enough to send a clear message. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, voice dripping with amusement. Still, she didn't react the way he expected. No panic, no pleading, just a slow, measured movement as she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The badge remained visible. The words "Special Agent" gleamed under the streetlights. But Mercer had already made up his mind. He wasn't backing down. The night air was still, but the tension in the air crackled like a live wire. Officer Mercer kept his gun trained on the woman as she stepped out of the SUV. His smirk deepened when she complied without hesitation. He expected resistance, maybe an argument, but she moved with the kind of ease that suggested she had been in situations like this before. That only annoyed him more. She was too calm, too confident. Mercer wasn't used to that. Usually, when he pulled someone over and pulled his weapon, there was immediate fear. A frantic explanation, hands trembling in the air, desperate attempts to defuse the situation. But this woman didn't look afraid. She looked prepared, and that made him want to push harder. Her badge was still clipped to her belt, gleaming under the soft glow of the streetlights. She didn't try to shove it in his face. She didn't even reference it. She simply stood there, waiting, her hands in plain sight. He scoffed. In his mind, she was just trying to play a role, trying to act above the law. Maybe she'd gotten away with it before. Maybe she had flashed that badge during other stops, intimidating officers into letting her go. But not this time. Not with him. With his gun still raised, Mercer took a step closer. His heart was pounding, but not with fear. With power. The situation was his to control. He was the authority here. That badge meant nothing. His mind raced. He could detain her for obstruction. He could claim she was impersonating an officer. Maybe even say she reached for something when she got out of the car. He had options, and none of them favored her. A few cars had slowed down, their drivers rubbernecking to see what was happening. He caught the glow of a phone screen inside one of them. Someone was recording. That only fueled his aggression. He didn't care who watched. "You think that badge means something to me?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. He let out a sharp laugh, tightening his grip on his gun. Still, she didn't move, didn't flinch. Something about her silence rattled him. He needed to escalate. He needed control. Holstering his weapon, Mercer lunged forward, grabbing her wrist roughly. The moment his fingers locked around her arm, he felt the solid muscle beneath her coat. He yanked her forward, dexterous, twisting her toward the hood of her SUV. If she wanted to play law enforcement, she could get treated like a suspect. The moment he made contact, everything changed. A voice crackled through his radio. Sharp, urgent, a code he recognized immediately. A distress call. For this very stop. He barely had time to process it before another set of headlights flooded the street. Tires screeched. A second patrol car whipped into view, stopping just feet away. Doors flew open. Officers rushed toward him, but they weren't coming for backup. They were coming for him. Mercer barely had time to react before the second set of officers closed in. His grip on the woman's wrist loosened slightly, confusion flickering across his face. His instincts told him that backup had arrived, that these officers were here to support him. But something felt off. They were moving too fast, their urgency aimed not at the woman, but at him. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. This time, the voice of the dispatcher came through, sharp and commanding. The words hit him like a brick. "Stand down, Officer Mercer. Do not engage. Suspect is a federal agent. Repeat, stand down." His blood ran cold. One of the approaching officers had his hand on his holster but didn't draw his weapon. His eyes locked onto Mercer's, filled with something Mercer wasn't used to seeing from fellow officers. Concern, maybe even suspicion. The FBI agent he had been manhandling stood completely still, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to speak. The situation was unfolding on its own. Mercer straightened his posture, his hand twitching at his side. He needed to regain control, to justify his actions, but words failed him. He had laughed at her badge. He had drawn his gun. And now his own department was telling him he had made a mistake. The second patrol car had barely come to a stop before one of the responding officers rushed to his radio, confirming something with dispatch. Mercer caught fragments of the exchange. "Agent verified, assigned to federal operations in this district. We have a situation." His heart pounded against his ribs. The reality of what he had done started sinking in. She wasn't just an agent. She was high-ranking enough that her status had triggered an immediate department-wide response. A call like that didn't happen for just anyone. Mercer's mouth went dry. He had treated this woman like any other person he thought he could intimidate, never considering for a second that she might have more power than him, more authority, more connections. He forced himself to keep his stance firm, but a cold sweat was forming on the back of his neck. The weight of the officer's stares pressed down on him. The street was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the crackling radio and the distant hum of traffic. One of the responding officers took a single step forward. His voice was low but firm. "Turn around." Mercer felt his breath catch. For the first time since pulling over the SUV, he was no longer the one in control. Mercer's mind raced, but his body stayed frozen. His training told him to respond, to assert control, but control had already slipped through his fingers. The weight of his badge, his gun, his uniform, none of it shielded him now. The very authority he had relied on to dominate others was crumbling beneath him. The FBI agent remained where she was, unshaken, unmoving. She had known from the beginning how this would end. She hadn't fought back, hadn't resisted, because she had never needed to. The moment Mercer had drawn his weapon on her, his fate had been sealed. The officer in front of him didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The silence between them stretched, thick with expectation. Mercer's fingers twitched at his sides. His eyes darted between the agent, the officers, and the growing number of onlookers. The flashing lights bounced off the surrounding buildings, illuminating the scene like a stage. He had been in this position before, but on the other side of it, he had been the one giving orders, the one making arrests. Now he was the one standing in the spotlight, waiting for someone else to decide his next move. Another officer approached from behind. Mercer heard the sound before he felt it, the distinct clink of handcuffs being unclipped from a duty belt. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His mind scrambled for a defense, for an excuse, for a way out. He could argue that he didn't know, that she hadn't identified herself clearly, that she had been acting suspiciously. But he knew, and everyone here knew, that none of that would hold up. The badge had been there. The authority had been clear. He had ignored it. Worse, he had mocked it. The officer behind him grabbed his wrist. The touch sent a jolt of reality through his body, but it was too late to pull away. His other wrist was seized just as quickly, his arms wrenched behind his back in one swift motion. Cold steel locked around his skin. The silence was deafening. The agent didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched as the process unfolded, the same way she would have watched any routine arrest, because that's what this was now. Routine. Mercer wasn't special. He wasn't different. He was just another officer facing consequences for a choice he had made. His badge was removed from his chest. His weapon was taken from its holster. It all happened quickly, methodically, like a well-rehearsed procedure. He had laughed at her badge. Now his was gone. The officers flanking him exchanged brief words into their radios confirming the detainment. A black SUV, different from the one the agent had been driving, pulled up to the curb. The doors opened. Mercer knew what was coming next. He had done it to others countless times before. Now it was happening to him. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Mercer's wrists as he was led toward the waiting SUV. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. The world around him continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passing in the distance, people watching from sidewalks, cell phones held high to capture every second. But for him, everything had changed. His badge was gone, his gun was gone, his power was gone. The FBI agent stood nearby, speaking calmly into her phone. She hadn't needed to raise her voice once during the entire ordeal. No threats, no arguments, no resistance. She had let the system do exactly what it was designed to do, for her, not for him. Mercer had spent years believing he was untouchable. He had seen officers walk away from worse situations with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. But he also knew that this time was different. She wasn't just some random driver. She was the law. And the law had come for him. The officers who had once been his colleagues treated him with professional detachment. No sympathy, no camaraderie, just duty. He was placed into the back seat of the SUV, the door closing with a finality that made his stomach churn. As the vehicle pulled away, he stared out the window, watching the scene fade behind him. The flashing lights, the gathering crowd, the woman he had tried to intimidate standing tall with her badge still gleaming at her side. The video of the incident hit the internet within hours. The footage was damning. Mercer laughing at the FBI badge, pulling his weapon, twisting the agent's arm only to be detained minutes later. The clip spread like wildfire, news outlets picking it up, commentators dissecting every second. A local officer arrested after pulling a gun on an FBI agent during a traffic stop. Authority abused and revoked. How one cop's arrogance led to his downfall in under 2 minutes. There was no spinning the narrative. The evidence was clear. The world had seen him act, and the world had seen him fall. An official statement from the police department followed soon after. Mercer was placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. The words were carefully chosen, neutral, and measured, but he knew what they really meant. His career was over. There would be hearings, reviews, endless paperwork, but the outcome was inevitable. He had humiliated the department, and no one would save him from the consequences. As for the agent, she never gave an official comment. She had no need to. She continued her work without interruption, unaffected by the chaos that had unfolded around her. She had always known how it would end. And Mercer, he had spent his entire career believing that the badge made him untouchable. But he had laughed at the wrong one.